Hello, everyone. Salam, namaste, adab, and welcome to today's event. And, today we are going to listen to Professor Gyanendra Pandey, a very familiar and well-known historian and known personally to me also. Is a professor of arts and sciences, distinguished professor of history, and director of interdisciplinary workshop on colonial and postcolonial studies at Emory University in Atlanta. Uh, Formally, he will be introduced, he and as well as his team probably, by Professor Arjuna Padurai, who is a very distinguished professor uh, at NYU, as well as he was a very senior professor at Yale also, a very well-known anthropologist and a professor of culture and language also. Concluding remarks will be given by Professor Tanika Sarkar. Um, Again, most of our audience are familiar with her. Just 2 months back, she gave a talk on, I think, past overhaul, something like that. Yeah. So welcome you all. And actually, for a formal, more detailed introduction, I now invite Professor Padurai to do his 5, 6, 7, 8, 10 minutes talk. All right, whatever suits you. Thank you all. All right.
Well, thank you, Razi Raziuddin. I am very aware of your series, and I know many of the people who have been featured on it. So I'm very happy to be here. And I thank you for the opportunity and the invitation. I am going to take no more than my 7 minutes or 8 minutes. Because either one has to be in a situation like this, very brief or very lengthy, and the latter is not the right option. So I will take the former option of brevity and begin by saying about Professor Gyanendra Pandey. From here on, Gyan in my comments. I've had the pleasure of knowing Gyan for more than 4 decades. And of reading his work with pleasure and profit throughout that time. As many people, I'm sure, know, but it's worth again reminding us that he's a founding member of the fabled subaltern studies collective, which was coming into shape when I was a graduate student at the University of Chicago, and his guru, Ronajit Guha, and my guru, Bernard Cohn, were somehow in close touch. And when this school began, so I heard about it as a very ignorant, fledgling graduate student at the University of Chicago, that there was this incredible group of scholars, some in Australia, some in England, inspired by Ronajit Guha. And I soon learned, of course, that Gyan was a very important member of that group. And his first book on communalism and politics, it's not the title, but the topic, in Hindi-speaking North India, particularly UP in the colonial period, marked his arrival as a very distinctive voice in subaltern studies, but more generally in Indian history and historiography. And it's a book that is still very important for many of us, because it already contained the key elements of Gyan's voice and signature. Attention to detail, care about the world of the fact, an interest in big issues, but not at the cost of attention to detail, a lot of interest in language, all things that were noteworthy then and now. And I'm going back to the 70s, but really to the 80s and 90s. Gyan did other pioneering work on the topics of communalism long before it became a burning topic in the politics of India. Gyan was already aware that it was a very lethal space emerging as a, in part, colonial heritage. And he did other work on these topics, that is communalism, identity, colonialism, etc., focused on the partition, for example, on which he's done very important work individually and also editorially with others. And this work on the partition also was an expression of his, I think, career-long interest in memory and on the fragmented way in which historical materials appear before us. And it still remains, I think, a key to Gyan's distinctive contributions, that he's able to make more of the fragment, or to make the fragment greater than the fragmentary, if I may coin a phrase. In more recent years, I'm now skipping over many collections, many articles that flesh out all this, but for reasons of time, I'll move into the present. And in more recent times, specifically in the last, let's say 12 years, but in publication terms in the last 10, Gyan turned his attention to the vexed affinities between caste and race. And his 2013 book much preceded the recent efflorescence of works on the topic of what race has to do with caste and what it doesn't. That has grown as a field, but Gyan's book was very early and generative in this space. So I just quote briefly, if I may, from that book, where he says the following: upper caste, because ruling and dominant groups and classes across the globe believe it is their inherited right to rule and to live in special comfort and prosperity. Racism, because that is a way of keeping subordinate and marginalized groups, sometimes called minorities, in their place, in quotes. And because the assumption of the right to rule, property, and culture, in single quotes, leads to the segregation and subordination of those without privileged access to these, and to their denigration, castigation, and even expulsion at times when they are seen as challenging the existing order of caste and race, black and white. So this paragraph is quite provocative, partly because it says that upper caste, that the upper quality is what unites, let's say, casteism and racism in the history of prejudice. And right there is a provocation which could lead to many volumes of discussion and fruitful debate. And there are other things, very typically Gyan, like the very subtle reference to Ranajit Guha's great book, A Rule of Property for Bengal, which is somewhat forgotten now, and is an extremely important monograph. And it has many other touches of Gyan's subtle way of thinking about these major historical and historiographic problems. And now he surprises us again, and I'm sure he's going to talk about this, so I don't want to preempt or anticipate anything he might say, but I've had the pleasure of reading the manuscript of his forthcoming book, which will appear in 2024, called Family Men at Home in Colonial and Post-Colonial India. I have, as I say, had the pleasure of reading this manuscript and discussing some of it with Gyan. I'll only say here that again, Gyan brings to us in this book his acute archival sensibility, his eye for the nooks and crannies of recorded memory, and his concern about the complexities of subalternity. All this to the topic of male domesticity. Among other things, this book is a subtle revision of the highly familiar equation of home with women and the public sphere with men, reinscribed in India in the colonial period. Here we see the intimate world of patriarchal power, of the ways in which the home functioned to refine masculinity. We can also see that the separate histories of masculinity and domesticity might have come together uniquely in colonial modernity. So I'm going to conclude, though I could say a lot more on each of these points about the fragment, about communalism, about militant Hinduism, about the politics of the cow, all things in which Gyan has put us in his debt. But I'll wind up, because I don't want to exceed my time in my brief, by saying that thinking, as I have done in the last few weeks, of the long durée of Gyan's work, it strikes me as a tapestry of fragments, and less like a Brodel-inspired tribute to the everyday, and more in the genealogy of the great English poet William Blake, whom I quote from the first line of his 1803 poem called Auguries of Innocence. And I do so because I think it captures something of Gyan which exceeds our expectations and habits in regard to history and historiography. Here is the first 4 lines of this William Blake poem. To see a world in a grain of sand and a heaven in a wild flower, hold infinity in the palm of your hand and eternity in an hour. That's William Blake. And for me, that's the genealogy in which I have experienced Gyan's work and voice. So thanks very much. And now I hand over to, I think, Gyan himself.
Thank you very much, Arjun. I'm going to skip the Professor Apudurai from the beginning, out of friendship. I want to say that after that introduction, it's probably best I don't say anything at all. But given that Razi wouldn't forgive that, I will say something about the book that is going into production. I want first to thank Razi Bhai for this wonderful work that he has done and his colleagues have done in this forum. And to keep it going in this way weekly for so long is enormous victory. It is a wonderful thing in our times and really important. So thank you for that, and thank you for inviting me to present here. I want to thank Arjun and Tonika, Professor Sarkar. Once again, I will say Tonika, out of friendship, old friendships, and all my other friends who are here and those who've come here for the first time, or for the first time to hear me speak about some new work. A book entitled Fragments of Family, Men at Home in Colonial and Postcolonial India. And I won't explain, though, because I think it's fairly obvious why I've shifted. I've moved from one kind of topic to another, from race and caste to communalism to partition to violence to this particular topic. If anyone has questions, I'll come back to that. I'll come to that. I'm happy to explain it. But this is what this book does. And because it's new, I may go on a bit longer than I should. So Arjun or Razibhai, please just stop me or tell me when you want me to stop in about 5 minutes. Okay? This book investigates the mysterious presence, absence of men in the home, in and from a large part of their existence, a place or a world, an arena in which they spend a great deal of their time and on which they heavily depend, however much they might deny it. That's what the book is about. It begins by situating men firmly in that domestic space. And hence the subtitle, Men at Home. But Men at Home also because I asked the question and spend a lot of time thinking through in the book, where men are most comfortable and where women are perhaps most uncomfortable. So men at home may not be at home so much inside the domestic space as outside. And that is the case in many, many examples and interactions. That's the way it comes through. But the second half of my subtitle is very important too. And that is the focus on colonial and post-colonial India. Something startling and novel happens at this time in the idea of home and family, the ideal man and the ideal woman. I want to stress a similar shift takes place in the industrial and post-industrial age over much of the world. New ideas of family, new ideas of what it is to be a man and a woman, even if they build upon inheritances which are very significant and clear. These are really quite distinct, and their distinction, their novelty is something that is worth marking. It is startling in many, many ways. But the colonial and post-colonial India moment in this is important because India's industrial and post-industrial times, the colonial and post-colonial times, are marked by very different inflections, not only because of an Indian inheritance, which is ancient and varied and complex, but also because of the colonial impact and the colonial presence and its post-colonial ramifications, if you like. I suggest the growing influence in 19th and 20th century South Asia of ideas, or better, I'll say, notions or ideals of, or aspirations to, among other things, the small consanguine nuclear family, on the one hand. The consanguine nuclear family, husband, wife, children, even if this becomes an ideal of significance, even if the nuclear family is modified in the South Asian case so quickly into a 3-generational family, grandparents living together with parents and children, sometimes more generations, even if cognitive nuclear families, the nuclear families of male siblings live under the same roof or in adjacent flats and dwellings and so on and so forth. The idea of the nuclear family, the small, loving family unit, is something that is new, distinct, and very important to work with. In the same way, I'm just going to give you one other very different kind of example. Industrial time comes to be a marked presence, an important factor in the lives of people all through the subcontinent, not only in the urban areas. Industrial time, that is time that is marked by the clock, time that is marked by the starting and ending of factory work, and of bureaucratic work and business work and so on and so forth. Industrial clock time, which is very different from what obviously continues to be important. A much more fluid sense of time marked by light and dark, marked by agricultural seasons and a ritual calendar, all of which are fluid in all sorts of ways, and which seem much more natural. I suggest the coexistence of these times is of enormous importance, not only in the urban areas where factories and mills and the big state institutions are, but in areas that are removed from that, in semi-urban, in rural areas, areas that are seen as not particularly marked by modern capitalist enterprise. Through, if nothing else, through the workings of state power, through the workings of the police, of the schools, of medical practices, of courts, that require attendance at in a different kind of time scale. So I'm suggesting, and this happens with many other things, but what I suggest is through all of this, there is a thickening and a concretization. I might even say an externalization and objectification of the inner and the outer, of the home and the world. And with that, even of ideas of education, fostering and nurturing, the ways in which knowledge and cultural inheritance is passed on, and what the roles of men and women in the home and the world should be. All of these are externalized and objectified in a way that I do not believe they ever were before. In that context, this book focuses particularly on formal schooling as education and cleanliness in dress and appearance as signs of the modern, because this is a repeated motif all through. And the roles of men and women in childcare and homemaking. I focus on conjugal relations in particular in the book, because these are central to the new ideas of family and home, or central to these configured ideas of family and home. And through the detailed explorations of conjugal relations, I focus on the consequences in terms of daily attrition, constant negotiation, and the insidious reinforcement of hierarchies. The enduring physical, psychological, and emotional costs for men and women, the axiomatically privileged and the regularly disenfranchised alike. I should add, though I won't spend any time on this just now, that because there is no such thing as the Indian home or the South Asian domestic world, I have focused on 3 different groups. I work primarily in northern, central, and western India areas, and northwestern areas which I know something, and areas where I'm familiar with the language to some extent. I work in these areas on the Hindu and Muslim elites first, that is the Bade Log, the Ashraf, the Bhadra Log, the respectable people. And on the other hand, as a counterpoint, I also take significant time in the book to think about the conditions of some of the lowest castes and classes. And I do this through Dalits, who have become middle-class people, but who write about their parents and their grandparents, their immediate predecessors, and their own lives in childhood, in the countryside as well as in the towns, in a very different condition. This is the Ajlaf, this is the Hoi Polloi, these are the Chote Log, the Garib, the Gurba, and it's fairly important to think domestic worlds there too. And I want to say just once, because I won't have time to dwell on this, that these two, in these areas too, Industrial time obviously matters, but the nuclear consanguine smaller unit also comes to be a more insistent presence or demand or ideal. Respectability itself becomes an ideal with social mobility, respectability of a very different kind. That said, what I'm going to try and do here is just draw from the last chapter of my book, which tries to pull together several of the arguments that have gone, that run through the preceding chapters. The last chapter is 7. There's a prelude and there's a postlude, if you like, an epilogue. So this final chapter tries to pull together a lot that I've said before. And I'm going to focus on 3 different things, which the chapter does. Men's thinking on the nature and aptitude of women, on which, of course, the entire domestic world and men's place in the home and the world depends. There's a persistence here, perhaps the elevation of the ideal woman to a new status of the unique, ethereal mother goddess, woman as quintessential mother. And I will deal with this. And I suggest that we may have too quickly assumed, because they are mother goddesses, women, ordinary women, have always been mothers. I suggest that this is something that is happening here insistently and unexpectedly in all sorts of places where you wouldn't expect it. I'll give some examples in a moment. But the second thing, the first is men's thinking on the nature of women. The second is men's thinking about their own talents and responsibilities. Ideal men born to work, to put all into the making of the good society, especially in this time, through the promotion of formal schooling and a scientific outlook. In the home, they become quintessential educators and disciplinarians. And this is something that several scholars have already written about, spoken about, amongst them Tonika Sarkar and Shopna Banerjee. But I will dwell on this and its consequences to some extent in my brief comments. But finally, thirdly, I want to speak at least briefly about women's thinking, about men's thinking on the nature of men, which is something that men do not typically talk about, the nature of men. You know, they don't call it that. They call it the nature of women, sure. But women's thinking on men's thinking highlights its many contradictions and points to the sharp distinctions and hierarchies that the modern has produced in South Asia as elsewhere, I suggest. So let me begin with the first thing, men's thinking on the nature of women. And that section in my chapters has been called, it's called Little Mother. And I don't need to explain that title. I'll just say that modern male thinkers, remarkable people, in fact, speak about the extraordinary status of Indian women from hoary times forever as mothers, as they elevate them. Here is what Premchand says in a 1931 essay. We will now, in the new wave of nationalism, obliterate all gender distinctions, he says. At the same time, somehow, we restore our mothers, that is girls and women, to their exalted place in the society as mothers. Rajendra Prasad speaks about Gandhi's wife, Kasturba, as mother to all, the very ideal of a Hindu woman, a symbol of Indian culture, and a bundle of love. And, you know, any of us could multiply those examples over and over and over again what I'm going to do is just turn to one figure, Harivansh Rai Bachchan, the father of Amitabh Bachchan, a great poet in his own right, a distinguished figure through his life, a person who married twice, but who writes in a 4-volume autobiography at great length about his life and loves, beginning with the love for his closest non-kin brother's wife. And this is teenage love. This is, Bachchan himself is perhaps 15 or 16 at the time. That bride, his older brother, his 18-year-old brother's newly wedded wife, is perhaps 14, perhaps 15. And he starts with his love for her. I'm only going to use 3 examples, that particular one, and I'll refer to the second, to his first wife and his second wife after that, to reinforce the argument, or to make the argument of how widespread this notion of woman as mother comes to be, and how it is employed with the kinds of consequences it has. Champa, the bride of his older non-kin brother, is, as I say, is a teenager. His older brother dies within months of their being married. His older brother is so close to Harivansh Rai Bachchan that both Bachchan and the brother spend all their time with the new bride. And she is flattered, pleased, very close to both of them. After the brother dies, Bachchan spends all his time mourning with his bhabhi. And as he does so, he impregnates her in an accidental moment, as he says. When the girl's mother-in-law discovers she's pregnant, she drives Bachchan out, though she loves him. She loved him as closely as she loved her son almost. And she takes Champa off to the hills, to the Himalayas, to Badrinath, for penance, but also for abortion. And they're away for a year, or nearly a year. And when Champa comes back, she is absolute skin and bones. She's a skeleton, because she has gone through the mill of abortion and penance. And Bachchan writes about this moment and about how when he met Champa, she spoke to him like a mother. And she said to him, it was her fault, not his. He must go back to school. He must continue his career. He must do things. He will achieve great things. He is born for that. She will not live long, she knows, but she gives him her blessings for a good and long life and for great achievements, which is unfortunately how it happens. She actually dies the next day. Before she dies, she has had this meeting with him. And luckily, her own mother-in-law dies shortly afterwards because of the kind of grief that she's gone through. But here is what Bachchan writes in his autobiography written 4 decades later about that moment, that exchange, and his understanding. Champa, he says, revealed to me the mother form inherent in every woman, when she spoke to him as the son. Woman is, and in the second volume, written a year later of his autobiography, in the second volume of his autobiography, he says, woman is in essence precisely a mother. Compassion, tenderness, affection, daya, karuna, mamta are the fount of her love. Woman's love is but an aspect of her parental feelings, vatsalya. He goes on to say, from the day of her return from Badrinath, when Champa addressed me as if I were her son, and took all my sins into herself, blessed me and sent me off, and then a few hours later departed the world. I have used the benediction, O Ma, mother, to remember her and all other women, mothers, he says, Ma Jati Ki Sari Nariyan, alive or dead, who have come into my life. Okay? Now, I just want to skip from that very quickly to his first wife. He was married off a few years later to a very young girl whom he found innocent, a child, and so on and so forth, but who turned out to be, according to him, like a mother. Within a year, she was looking after him, even as she nursed her own mother who was suffering from tuberculosis and contracted tuberculosis herself and was ill for the rest of her life, dying many, many years later. But they don't have much of a close relationship. What he recollects of her is the self-sacrificing mother, how she kept her illness hidden from him and from everyone else who was around him, how she did everything to make them happy, to make them capable or to enable them to achieve what they were out to achieve. And interestingly and surprisingly, in Bachchan's second marriage with Teji Bachchan, the mother of his sons, and his remarkable partner, he says, you know, this is a mature marriage. Teji is 29. He is 36. Bachchan is 36 when they marry. After a whirlwind romance, she gives up her lectureship in psychology in Fateh Chand College in Lahore and goes to Allahabad to marry him and look after him. He says from that day in 1942 when they married to 1991 when he writes the last volume of his autobiography, she has taken on every task of looking after the home, looking after the children, their education, etc., to leave him free to do his poetic and intellectual work. And he writes about this in exactly the same tone, about the mother character in the woman. It is the motherness that stands out. He talks about how Teji grew up without a mother. And then he writes, she has made up for the absence of a mother's love and the pain that flowed from it by developing an especially tender mother's heart. She has, he describes her love as rooted in compassion and tenderness. The twin meanings are encapsulated in the Hindi, karuna. More specifically, in a mother's tenderness, matra karuna. His love for her, on the other hand, is rooted in gratitude, kritagyata. On women's love, further, he says, compassion is nobler than love, for love is tinged with selfishness. His wife, Teji, has never had that selfishness in her. From the moment she becomes a mother, her children become her life. And she looks after him like a child as she looks after her children. This is her description of a woman who has been a remarkable force in his life and who continues to be active and creative throughout her life in spite of having given up her career for him. She also goes in protest against the killing of students in 1942, a few months after the marriage when she is pregnant. She goes to the court in Allahabad and he has to run to find her because he doesn't know where she's gone. It's that kind of spirited woman. For him, she is motherness personified. That's the first part of this final chapter. The second part is men's thinking about their own talents and responsibilities. The accomplished human being, which is really the accomplished man being in many, many cases. And I give examples of this throughout my book from Hindus and Muslim families and individuals, from Dalits and so on. But I want to focus here on one person who has written about this at great length in a 6-volume autobiography, Rahul Sankrityayan, the great, what shall I say, the great scholar, the rescuer of the scholarly study of Buddhism in India, a communist and a Buddhist, a Hindu reformer, and a Mahapandit. Rahul Sankrityayan writes a book called Ghumakkar Shastra. Ghumakkar Shastra being a treatise on the philosophy of wandering, which is what he says is the task of the superior, is the call of the superior human being. And I stress human being because while Rahul Sankrityayan, who is a radical, a remarkable activist, communist, Buddhist, intellectual, and a believer in the rights of men and women in general, while he says this is something that is available to all men and women, he makes clear through all of his writings that women will have much greater difficulty in fulfilling this thing because they are in much greater danger. Nonetheless, he goes on, and I need to quote him just a little bit, if I can find the pages. Yeah. Here we are. Wandering is the religion of humanity. Whoever gives it up is unworthy of being called a human being. And he speaks about the great humans who have wandered the world and made the world. The Buddha, Guru Nanak, Dayanand Saraswati, and other makers of modern India. And he would have added the Prophet Muhammad and Jesus Christ and Martin Luther, the Protestant priest, had he cast his net farther afield. But he writes about this at length in all sorts of writings. And I'm going to use a book of his which is less commonly used than Ghumakkar Shastra to make the point as he makes it. In 1956 or 7, he wrote a book on Swami Harishanand, a person 3 or 4 years older than him, from a much poorer background, but a person who'd spent his life, like Rahul, wandering, searching for spiritual truth, and then searching for scientific truth. He becomes an Ayurveda, a doctor, and remarkably knowledgeable in that. And he becomes a political activist as well in search of social justice. So Sankrityayan writes, Ghumakkar, christens him Ghumakkar Swami, the wandering religious mendicant, and writes this biography of Swami Harishanand, whom he also takes on as his elder brother because he is so, what shall I say, admiring of his work. Their life parallels one another, Harishanand's and Sankrityayan's, in many, many ways, including Ghumakkari, a life of wandering, a long search for spiritual and scientific truth, a commitment to scientific observation, demonstrable knowledge, political activism. And then finally, they are parallel to each other in marrying late in life with a woman, in both cases, 30 years younger than them, over 30 years younger than them. In Harishanand's case, it is 32 years younger than him. In Sankrityayan's, it is 37 years younger than him in their old age. And both do it in their old age for Sankirtan has had 2 marriages before that. He was married as a child, not by his own choice, but he abandoned that wife and in search of his truth and spiritual and scientific enlightenment. And then as a teacher, he goes to Leningrad, Russia, and he marries a Russian woman, a common law wedding, and has a son by her. But that too he leaves to continue his political activism and his intellectual work in India. Here is what he says about Harishanand's marriage, which, as I said, parallels his own third marriage in a remarkable way. Suddenly, at the age of 52, in the midst of his search for scientific truth and social and political justice, the Swami became a householder. Rahul spells out the reasoning. Despite his large circle of friends and hangers-on, Sankirtan writes, there was no one who would support him fully in his declining years, Harishanand in his declining years. No one whom he could call his own and who could call him hers. He thought only a woman could fulfill that role. Nature had made man and woman dependent on one another. The service and support a woman can provide, no one else can. This is Sankirtan writing. What the Swami did at the age of 51 or so was advertise in the newspapers, specifying the kind of woman he wanted, also that it would be a civil marriage with no expense, and that he would look after his wife well. He was a very well-to-do medical practitioner by this time in Amritsar. He interviewed 15 applicants after looking through all the things, and selected Janki Devi, a young Brahmin woman from Etawah, several hundred miles to the southeast of Amritsar, beyond Delhi. She was 20 to his 52. At a very early age, she had been married off to an old man. He died within 6 months, so she was a child widow. Her father was a reformist of some kind, small-time medical practitioner. He sent her to school, and he was very happy that she was able to marry again. Janaki Devi, the wife of Harishanand, was by Sankirtan's account everything that the Swami needed. And these are some of the things he spells out. She was an extraordinary cook. She fed guests magnificently, and she looked after Harishanand with the greatest of care. In 1949, soon after their marriage, her husband fell prey to a digestive disorder and almost died of it. He became skin and bones. He fainted. He couldn't stand up and so on. Because of her care and her tending of him, there was a kind of miracle, and he survived and recovered. And Rahul writes, the Swami should congratulate himself on his choice of his wife. Yet, despite a gentleness and calmness in her disposition, the strain of looking after her husband clearly showed. She often looked stern and sometimes lost her temper. Sankirtan records in his autobiography such an outburst. On September 9th, 1955, he says, there was a clash between Bhaiya and Bhabiji, his older brother and the older brother's wife. Bhabiji should be appointed head of the enemy forces. She was spitting out poison against all men. And he says he was a mute onlooker, but he writes, he produces a five-point manifesto, which I just want to conclude with. 1, an older man should never marry a young woman. 2, he who has not taken on the responsibilities of a householder to the age of 50 should be doubly careful. Never, ever, he writes in Sanskrit. 3, that he has not taken on the responsibilities of a householder all that time means that he was fired by some ideals. 4, anyone who has spent a long life wandering the world seeking knowledge should keep far away from marriage. 5, if in addition, anyone who has spent a long life of wandering the world should keep far away from marriage. 5, if in addition he is addicted to a quest for knowledge, the prohibition is absolute. Thus, what Sankirtan does is denounce anything that goes against the realization of what he calls independent man's full potential. In the cause of man, capital, and mankind, he sacrifices the cause of ordinary living men and women. The position of the householder and maker is best avoided, he says. And it's a bizarre proposition, given his own marital history and the dependence on, and his own dependence on women and domesticity throughout his life. I want to finally just speak about women's thinking on the nature of men, and I'll do this as briefly as I can. I'll do this through the writings of, or through reference to Baby Kamble, a Dalit writer, a writer of one of the first Dalit women's autobiographies in modern times, published in 1986. The translation of this book came out in 2005. And just before that translation, she was interviewed by my friend, the translator, my friend Maya Pandit. And that translation, that interview is reproduced in the translation. And in the autobiography, as well as in the translation, Baby Kamble spells out, captures the banality of men's claims to God-given power, talent, and privilege in a single edgy concept, naurapana, husbandness, from the Marathi, naura, husband. And I want just to quote a little bit from that thing and from what Baby Kamble says about it, which is, this happens, she says in an interview, in the context of the fact that she kept her writing, her autobiographical writing, hidden from her family for 20 years. Only one brother knew about it, a brother who used to give her some paper and pencils and so on and so forth. Nobody else in her house knew about it until an American visitor to that area, an anthropologist investigating Dalit life, talked to her, discovered she had written, and had the writings published in serially. When they were published, her family discovered she was a writer. When Maya Pandit interviewed her, she asked her why she had kept her writing hidden from everybody for 20 years. And she says in that interview, it was because of her husband. He was a good man, but like all the men of his time and generation, he considered a woman an inferior being. She writes of how wives, how husbands were taught to treat their wives as footwear. That's where they're stationed, that's where they belong. And how husbands were always suspicious and punishing of their wives for any believed transgression. You know, any suspicion that they'd looked at a man, any suspicion that they had transgressed, not done, fulfilled their duties. And she sums up all of this in the single edgy concept of naurapana. Naurapana, husbandness, she says, is the same in every man. Their male ego gives men some sense of identity, of privilege, of maleness. And her own feeling is, I want to suggest that this comes through in the writing of many other people I deal with in this last chapter. It comes from the writings of Rahul Sankrityan's third wife. That is, her name is Kamla Sankrityan, 37 years junior to him, who worships Rahul Sankrityan because of his great learning, because she has rescued her, a young high school student, and married her later, from poverty, from and tried to teach her, to give her the blessings of a scholar's life, the blessings of a middle-class life. Yet, he is enormously critical of her in the first years of their marriage. When their children, they have two sons, a son and a daughter, within the first 5 years of their marriage. And when those children are still not more than 2 and 4, he wants her to focus on her PhD, to spend all her time on studies, and to accompany him on research trips in various places, which she finds it impossible to do. They fight greatly over this in the period, in the mid 50s, in the 5, 6, 7 years after their marriage. And when they do so, she is in tears much of the time. And she writes about the torment she is suffering from what he does to her, and from his complaints in his diary and in letters to friends, and from his behavior, his restlessness, his anger, his irritation. And she says, she complains about this in letters that she leaves for him on the desk in their Mussoorie home, in which she says, you know, this tormenting, you're breaking me, you are making me come apart. It is the opposite of what I would expect from you. This is not what I would expect from somebody as distinguished, as high-ranking, as worship-worthy as my husband. And he says, in all of this, his behavior is like that of an ordinary man, samanya purush admi. I want to suggest that Kamla Sankrityan's ordinary man, nature of an ordinary man, is the same as Baby Kamble's Naurapana. It is what comes through in their taking on the role of the boss, of the educator, of the disciplinarian. And this is something that I seek to illustrate, and I do so right through this book, in many, many examples. Striking examples of this and striking statements about this come from Kamla Sankrityan, who speaks about woman's life as a veil of tears. And she actually describes marriage as the bond that produces these tears, and the jail that she has to inhabit because of the kinds of demands and pressures put upon her by her husband. Jagjivan Ram's second wife, Indrani Jagjivan Ram, suffers the same sort of thing in 1942, when she says, and she's a fairly well accomplished school teacher who's left her urban home in Kanpur to come and live with him in the countryside, and then follow him in his ministerial career when he becomes a junior Congress minister and then a major Congress leader. And in 1942, when he's about to go to jail in the Quit India movement, and they're living in Patna, she says, this time I too will go to jail. And he says to her simply, well, you know, he laughs at her. And then when he realizes she's serious, he says, look, how can we both go to jail? Who will look after my mother, Jagjivan Ram's mother? And who will look after her son, their son, their 2-year-old son, Jagjivan and Indrani's son? You must stay here to look after them. I will go to jail. And she says to him, okay, you go to the public jail and I will stay in the jail at home. That is our allotted duty. And I suggest to you that in this kind of conflict, in the statements that we have of the anger of Janki Devi, Swami Harishanand's wife, of her outbursts against him for his behavior like a child, of Rahul Sankrityan's irritability and outbursts, of Indrani Jagjivan Ram's and Kamla Sankrityan's statements about the jails they must inhabit. We have a remarkable comment and an iteration, reiteration, which is very, very widespread through colonial and post-colonial India, through all of the groups that I've been talking about, of the notion of the ideal man, the ideal woman, and the ideal domestic arrangements. I could go on. I've just finished this book, and you know that there is, as I've indicated already, there's a great deal of work there, but I have taxed your patience enough. I should stop there, and thank you for your patience, and look forward to your comments. Thank you.
Thank you. Remarkable story. So let's hear Professor Tanika Sarkar, and after that we will come for question and answer. Okay.
That was indeed remarkable. And it's a privilege to be here to discuss this remarkable book. And I have to thank the organizers and the author for that. I'll drop the Professor Pandey and use Gyan as, when I refer to him. This was, Gyan, as Professor Appadurai already said, is in the habit of breaking new boundaries, new grounds. And this book is, again, a very important new departure. But there are strong continuities with his earlier work. And as Professor Appadurai said earlier, Gyan asks large questions, but with a finely grained sense of detail and context. And those traits persist in this book and make it very remarkable. I have read a couple of earlier versions of the manuscript, but the final manuscript, I don't know how much of what I read has been retained and how much has been left out. But let me begin with the concluding chapter that I read. I hope that is still in the book. The concluding chapter reveals a belated and traumatic revelation about hidden family secrets to the author. The revelation changed the images and the understandings of his parents and their lives.
Tanika?
Yes.
I'm sorry, may I just say, it's still there. That's not the chapter that I spoke from just here, but that's no problem. Please go ahead.
Okay. The revelation changed, thanks for keeping that on in. The revelation changed the images of and the understandings of his parents and their lives together that he had carried with him so far. The revelation also shocks the reader, and we can perhaps understand why he took up the project of probing families, especially the place and work of men within it, which is a new theme. So the book combines, I think, the autobiographical and the biographical, along with very precise context for each of the characters, each of the texts that he has used. And the texts and the characters are quite numerous. The book also blends two different narrative genres together, the historical and the literary, and they both are very prominent. It's really, he has studied so many texts and so many lives. It's really, to use Rushdie's words, it's an ocean of stories. But what's very new about it is that it looks at what men, husbands to be more precise, do at home, what they touch and do not touch, where they go and where they do not, what rules are there for them within homes as distinct from those for women. Above all, and Gyan spoke about it at some length right now, what they expect from women, how they define women's nature, and also to a lesser extent, he uses women's texts to show what women think of men and their nature. And how men's expectations turn into inflexible domestic norms, cutting across different contexts and very different kinds of lives. The book, therefore, adds much to our understanding of modern Indian masculinity and conjugality, of Indian modernity itself. It is surprising how closely matched men's expectations are of the good and desirable woman despite their many other differences. The woman, the wife, as the mother, as the little mother. And I suppose emergent nationalism focused attention on motherhood with the growing importance of coming generations that the mother must nurture. And I think it's a new imperative that begins to appear from the late 19th century. Before that, the focus of reformers, orthodoxy, everyone is concentrated on the woman as the wife, and then it moves to the mother. The home, however, is predominantly the conjugal space in the book, and men's relationships with children, especially daughters and mothers, or with domestic helpers within the household, remain, I thought, somewhat in the background. Maybe that's because the texts themselves are relatively silent about such relationships. If so, why were they silent? And that needs perhaps some explanation. I suspect too that the rules changed drastically at different stages in male and female life cycles. When old men retire and are largely confined to their homes, their occupation gone, and when the wife now becomes the senior mistress of the household and becomes the authority figure along with her grown-up sons. How do men at that age cope with the loss of power, the sense of redundancy? There are studies, very interesting studies of male aging in Chinese contexts and their domestic marginalization post-retirement. And I was just wondering if the text that Gyan uses have some reflections on that part of maybe the older generations that they referred to, did they feel that kind of redundancy? The book has something that is also very new. At times, it counterposes women's autobiographical writings to that of their husbands, to show where the representations of each other converge and where they fly apart. The comparative frame is most important and most interesting, and one rarely undertaken by feminist scholarship, I must admit. Hopefully, it will set a trend. It would have been, I would have liked him to focus a little more on narrative strategies and ploys that both sets of writings have used. He describes the text rather than scrutinize the emplotment and reads them as actual life, rather than as carefully designed artifacts. What the women especially reveal and what they hold back, and what they reveal, how they reveal, that might have added a little bit to the very, very remarkable work. Gyan uses a whole world of texts, the authors being well-known and mostly well-established men coming from a variety of backgrounds, landed aristocracy, bureaucracy, political and literary figures, as well as low caste and Dalit ones. A few are Muslims now in Pakistan, while the rest are Indian Hindus from various castes. Sometimes it covers several generations in the same family, as with the Bachchans, and that very interestingly captures changes in life patterns and experiences over time. The range is formidable. It's a fascinating spread. Such a large cast, however, leaves somewhat, a little room for important contrasts and comparisons, but we do have a fascinating spread. Something that remains implicit in the book is that all the authors of these texts are successful people, well established in their professions and in their vocations. If they are women, they are wives of illustrious men. If they come from Dalit or disadvantaged backgrounds, they have now moved up in the world and through education and career choices, or by playing a political role within the community or the nation. Is that the reason why they thought their lives were worth telling? How do they explain the autobiographical compulsion? And that's a very important question, especially for women who seldom think that their lives as their own lives are worth telling. How do they explain why they write an autobiography? They are, Jay Devika and Swati Joshi have done a little bit of work, and that adds a lot to the gender studies. How do they talk about their success? That I also thought was very interesting. They are all, despite their varied backgrounds, modern, educated people, men and women of a new generation. How do they describe their own times as progress or as decline? Finally, how do they explain that they need to describe their wives and their husbands? What makes them write so much about each other? Which is again a very, very new historical development that we haven't seen earlier. I found it very exciting that Gyan sees the home also not just as emotional space, but as planned and built domestic environment. And that's a very interesting addition. He assumes that the overall structure, the layout, the outer shape of the houses is largely the man's plan, while women shape the interior, which is their own space. And the division between the outer shape and the inner domain recalls Partha Chatterjee's gendered binary between the home and the world, but it concretizes that, makes it a sensuous, visible structure. But which women would plan the interior? The wife or the senior women in the household who might decide on which room would go to which wife and so on. Finally, a question. What was your intention in writing this book? I mean, what did you intend to illustrate with new and important details already existing studies by feminist and Dalit scholars on patriarchy and caste? Or did you want to modify existing understandings? If it is the latter, then you were too modest and you could have flagged the new points that you have made in the book more strongly. And finally, a small criticism. You use the term sansar, to signify the relationship between the home and the world. I think that's a bit misleading. The word actually means, I think, either the household or the domestic, or in a metaphysical sense, earthly existence itself. But that's a small point. So Gyan has talked a lot about various geographical contexts from which these texts emerge, and he has also referred to Rabindranath Tagore. I'll just, cite a line from a book that a Bengali woman wrote in 1863, where she described the Hindu household as a dense forest on the top of a remote mountain, dangerous mountain, infested by wild tigers, a place of danger, life-threatening danger. And I think that also bears out the points that Gyan makes. So I must congratulate you, Gyan, for writing a wonderful book, which is as exciting and as thoughtful as the text that you have used. I have learned a great deal from it, and so will the readers subsequently. Thank you. I hope I haven't taken up too much time.
No, not at all. Thank you so much. And thank you all three speakers. Now will be the time for question and answer. But before that, we have to do for the coming Saturday an announcement. The Indians, almost all Indians know about Habib Tanvir. Habib Tanvir was the master storyteller of the stage in India. So, and his very famous play, Agra Bazaar, will be presented by Danish Iqbal after a break of almost 2 months. Danish Iqbal is back and he will be presenting Agra Bazaar. And this is a story basically on the famous Urdu poet Nazir Akbar Abadi's, and it is a musical extravaganza. So thank you all. And now over to the question answer. And today our moderator is absent, Dr. Rafat Hussain. So I'll be doing the task. So please either raise your digital hand or write in the chat box or raise your physical hand for the questions if you have any. Do I see any? No, I don't see. So if I don't see, then I'll invite for further comments. Even the same speakers. Professor Appadurai, sir, if you want to make 1-2 minute comments further, that will be fine. Dr. Sayyid Amir Saab or any other senior or scholar person who wants to pursue anything or say anything, Professor Frank Pritchett or Barbara, anyone who wants to say something, please come forward. Dr. Abdul Jabbar. Yeah, you have to unmute yourself. You have to unmute yourself. Professor Abdurai, you have to unmute yourself.
I can speak for a minute, but if one of our other distinguished colleagues is ready to speak, I can.
No, go ahead, sir. Go ahead.
Yeah, so this is a great exchange. I can only say I'm very happy to be here. I've learned a lot also from Gyan's oral rendition of his book and from Tonika's really astute and acute comment. So, there are so many things to say, but I'll focus on just one, which is the idea of Nauraparna, husbandness, seems to be actually independent of the idea of men or masculinity as well as of marriage and actual husband status. It is husbandness, an idea that men have about themselves, whether they are young or old or married 3 times or not at all. So I think it's a very rich idea. And it leads me to a more general question, which is whether it is a product of colonial modernity or not. It seems very clear that women have a very hard time discussing their stories, either narratologically, as Tonika said, or empirically, without reference to men. But the bigger puzzle is, why do men need to bring women into the picture? In other words, there is a tension here between the idea that men are self-sufficient and the idea that they only exist because of women. So with women, it's clear. Men control them, they control the domestic space in certain ways, the political, but with women, they control neither really. So what is the need for the gendered other at all, as men pursue, as it were, freedom?
Okay, so let Gyan Sahab say something about it.
Thank you very much.
Gyan Sahab?
Yes, sure.
Yeah, and you are not seeing, so please turn on the video also.
My apologies, I turned that off by
Yeah,
mistake. I want to thank Tonika greatly for those detailed and very, very valuable comments, and Arjun for the follow-up question also, because of their enormous importance, the whole thing. I'm not going to try and respond to everything that Tonika has said. It would be very hard to do so quickly in any case, but I do want to say a couple of things. One, that one of the things, I said this at the beginning and it's in my title, one of the things that this book does is place men firmly in the domestic space and insistently in the domestic space. And I want to keep the focus on men in the home. One result of that is I have to hold the women back. I cannot discuss them very much, even though there is a lot more that they could say. I come to a discussion of what the women are saying in a very pointed way only in chapter 7, in the last chapter of my book. For precisely that reason. I spend a lot of time, I use women's autobiographies where they're available along with the men's, very much in tandem, to think through what are the kinds of propositions that are being made, what are the kinds of claims, what are the kinds of histories that are being written by these different articulations, in these different articulations. And what they tell us about the tensions, about the anticipations, the expectations of both men and women. But I have to hold the women back, in part because so many scholars have written superbly, very, very importantly, about what women have done in the home. And unfortunately, or interestingly, men have remained a kind of shadowy figure. There is reference to them, there is recognition of the changed position of men in the home. There is recognition of the new emergence of masculinity in fatherhood, for example, in Shobna's work, Shobna Banerjee's work. But there isn't that kind of detailed attention to day-by-day activities in the home, day-by-day attrition, negotiation, friction, or joy, collectivity, solidarity in the home. And I try, to the extent I can, because these are not easy things, they're not the things that people write about all of the time. I try as far as possible to focus that and to hold the women back, so that the men's role, anticipations, expectations are constantly in mind, and their dependence on the home and on domesticity, in spite of what they say about it. That's the first thing I would say. Secondly, I'm a little bit the writing itself must do this. For example, when you say, Thonika, that I use Shanshar as a relation between the home and the world, what I was trying to say was what you said, that Shanshar is very much used in one way, as the home, the household, right? And as you say, metaphorically, or as earthly existence. I'm using that simply to displace, to trouble the notion of the home and the world. And therefore, I talk about the world in the home. And I talk about the sansar of the home in that sort of sense. I'm using it differently. But I'm not, I'm well aware of the fact that languages are used in very, very different ways. Ghar Shanshar is an almost untranslatable term for the domestic into English. What would one say? And I write about this. But in any case, with all of that, I think it may come across in a way that I haven't suggested. The same thing in the architectural arrangements. I used that first sentence as, what shall I say, rhetorically almost, that men build houses, women make homes, right? I say something like that in that first sentence. And it is metaphorical. It is a statement not about the actuality, because the men don't make the houses, they don't build the houses. So often it's everybody else. And the same thing with the women. They are supposed to be homemakers. They are supposed to make the home. And this is not an inside-outside divide. It is a metaphorical, if you like, divide. And as I say, some of this will not come across because of the way in which I've written or spoken.
All right, let's move to next question is
Um,
from your own institution.
Just a second,
Okay, okay.
Razi Bhai, I just want to respond to Arjun's statement, which Tonika also asked. And that is just simply to say, why do wives speak about husbands? Arjun's responded to that to a large extent. I think there's something interesting in the fact that many more men are speaking about their wives. Bachchan is doing so, Rahul Sankrityayan is doing so. I do want to stress that most men who write autobiographies do not write about the domestic space, do not write about anything but their public careers. That continues right through this time. And so what is fascinating is that in 4 pages, in a 450-page autobiography by Rajendra Prasad, and the 4 pages on marriage, what does he leave out? What does he stress? And you can actually get a great deal out of it from that kind of silence. So there's discussion of all of that. I've tried not to read these things literally to tell us about these lives, to read them rather as displays, as articulations, as histories of imagined selves, of selves that people desired themselves to be. And, you know, again, that may not come across as well as I would like, but that's the attempt. Razi Bhai, I'll stop.
Yeah, all right. So,
Other
from your
question.
own institution, there is a senior scientist, Dr. Abdul Jabbar, who wants to say something.
Yeah,
It happens. It's such a coincidence. Yeah,
thank
all
you,
right.
thank you very much. I've been with Emory University for 26 years. For the first time, I listened to you, a remarkable lecture. Thank you for that. So I have a question in terms how the contemporary context, in the context of the present day, there is a move toward men managing, becoming all the chores at home, stay-at-home dads. So I have the experience in my life, in my daughter's life. So my son-in-law is doing that in a remarkable way. So what is your kind of thinking perspective on the present day transformation of the role, the reversal of roles played by women in the past to some degree to now the men doing the same? Thank you very much.
Gee, now it's up to you. Sure. Briefly, if you can.
Indeed. May I say that it's praiseworthy when men do that. Your son or your son-in-law doing it is a remarkable and very worthwhile thing. And there, I do think there's a lot of rethinking in certain circles in the United States, in the West, perhaps in India too. I want to say that we would be fooling ourselves if we think that this is happening on a very wide scale. I think it's important to notice what COVID did was actually produce stay-at-home moms who had to do all sorts of things in ways that, you know, they had struggled forever to try and get rid of those burdens, those impossible conditions of life and work. That seems to have returned with a vengeance in many, many places. And I also believe that an old sort of sense of men's privilege and responsibilities has returned with a vengeance in countries in South Asia, in a way in which it makes us absolutely essential for us to think through how heavily men are dependent on that domestic space, which they believe they don't have to do very much in. So I congratulate you for your family's enlightenment.
Yeah.
And hope that that will be the case more widely. That's all I can say.
So one of those days, I would like to see you on campus.
That'd be very nice.
I'm at the other side, Emory Vaccine Center.
Thank you. Thank you.
I look
So
forward to
let
it.
me move on to invite some other. Professor Nazia Hassan, are you there? It would be nice to hear from a woman professor from Aligarh. Nazia, hello. Oh, I think she is, although she is right here. Anybody,
Hello.
please? Yes, Nazia. Would you like to
Hello.
make some comment?
Good evening, everybody. I joined just now, but I could hear Pandey Saab praising women about the new duties and responsibilities which have revived in a way after the COVID. So I'm thankful that he acknowledges it. I wish I could have joined earlier. So I heard just the last two lines, perhaps. This is my loss that I lost this opportunity to hear to Pandey sir.
It's all right. It's all right.
Thank you.
So let's move to Professor Barbara McCullough. Yeah, please.
Unmute. Thank you very much, Gyan, for really introducing me, certainly, to texts that are extraordinarily rich, very interesting. This is going to be a wonderful book to read. So very, very important. And so the first examples you gave were just so powerful of this sort of male fantasy that has true implications for women's lives, of imagining women as, you know, totally in men's service, in the service of the household, in prepared to sacrifice. The whole notion of sacrifice, really extraordinary. It would have been helpful in some ways to get some of the dates for some of these, just to know when they were. But all of that seemed to me very, very powerful, very interesting. And my only question was, I wanted to come back to ask again Tanika's question. What would you say is really where, I mean, in addition to the richness of what you've given us in terms of these biographies, autobiographies, what is it that we take away from this that somehow changes our vision of men in the domestic space?
Thank you, Barbara. As I said, it's lovely to see you and lovely to have your question as well. Thank you for reiterating Tanika's question. I've been asked, first of all, let me just respond to the question about the ages. Harbansh Rai Bachchan was born in 1907, lived to 2003, and he was in the 1940s and 50s, lecturer in English in Allahabad University, a very distinguished poet by that time, very, very well known. And then he goes to the All India Radio Translation Division. Jawaharlal Nehru, he knew from Allahabad, takes him there. He becomes a bureaucrat. He becomes a member of the Rajya Sabha. And he is, of course, the father of the mega star, as it were, and now known more for that. But he has this extraordinary, really candid, truth-telling autobiography as he thinks it, which really is full of fantasy about his life and loves. And very revealing for that reason, very interesting, fascinating in all sorts of ways. Rupert Snell has translated and has an abridged version of his autobiography in a thing called In the Afternoon of Time, a Penguin book from India. So just in case you want that. Rahul Sankrityayan, the great scholar, the Buddhist, communist, Congress activist, peasant leader, etc., etc., and teacher in Russia, Sri Lanka, and beyond. Rahul Sankrityayan lived from 1893 to 1963. So Sankara is a little bit more, a little bit earlier, but nonetheless, he lives into the post-colonial period. And these people are very much part of the generation that was concerned with making a new India and with doing everything they could in rather different ways. Bachchan is not an activist in that way, but Bachchan is very much concerned with thinking the new India, with describing, poetizing, if that's the word, producing poetry about this new world. Baby Kamle, the third major person I referred to, is a Dalit activist who continues to live in the village, small town that she grew up in. She's not from a successful family, as Tonika said. She was accidentally discovered by an American anthropology student who went there, and she had been scribbling these notes about her life and the life of the community. She's an Ambedkarite. She becomes a local activist, or her father and her brother are, and she becomes the best known of all of them through writing this extraordinary autobiography, one of the first Dalit women's autobiographies. She's born 1912, and no, thereabouts anyway, 1919 maybe, and dies in 2012. And sadly, I had begun to work on her, but I never met her. I've been in touch with her translator, who was a good friend of mine, and I've been in touch with her son and so on. So anyway, that's one side of the thing. The question that you, as well as Tonika, have asked, and that I expect I will continue to be asked, is what was my purpose in writing this thing? What am I hoping that it will contribute? And I think the short answer is simply this, that I do believe that situating men in domestic space, which is a space that they deny, do not write about, that they wish away in all sorts of ways, just assume it's there, it has background, it happens. That already tells us something about our history, or focuses aspects of our history in South Asia and in other parts of the world that we have not focused, that we have not engaged with sufficiently. I believe that it changes our perspective on that history in a significant way, especially if we can pay attention to the detail. Because detailing this is extraordinarily difficult. It's something that is not detailed in general because it is natural. It is there as background. And so to make it not the background to a history, but the history that we should be attending to. This is the space in which, in the industrial and post-industrial age, men and women spend most of their time. This is a space that matters enormously because in this age too, notions of family and home and private and public, inner and outer, have changed dramatically. And once again, I think that in my book stresses the very unusual, the novel, the startling character of the changes in conceptions of family. You see, just think about it. The loving, consanguine, smaller family unit is not how family was thought through human history. It has been taught in various ways. I mean, you know, the loving family in Christian tradition is the family of Christ. The family in the West, as well as most other parts of the world, in agricultural communities, is the rural working household, which includes servants, includes all sorts of other people. It's a household. It's not this notion of the consanguine, loving family, an intimate, retreat from the rest of the world. Now, this is not to say that this has not been said by scholars. The scholarship on the home and family and women in India, women and children in India, is extraordinary, has been remarkable in the kinds of work that it has done and opened up. And yet, I think the startling novelty of these conditions, as I said in my oral remarks, even I suggest the startling novelty of woman as mother, as that self-sacrificing mother, is something that perhaps makes us rethink the history of what we understand now as the natural family, of domestic space, and of our lives, and of our natural conditions as children of parents and grandparents and so on, and parents of children. I do not know about the naturalness of these conditions, how much they disguise in terms of the startling changes in conception that come about. And I want to reiterate, last point, I want to reiterate one more time, that the feel of inhabiting these spaces or any life, the feel of it, and the desire to inhabit it in particular ways, that to me is the history that we need to be writing. The feel of it, the visceral sense of it. And the last section of my book is called History in a Visceral Register, a register that I believe is extremely difficult to touch, but I try to touch in that last part.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Somebody without a name, iPhone 7, wants to ask a question or comment. Please go ahead. Be very brief. If you're still here. Hello?
Yeah,
So, yes, please.
that's
Go
me.
ahead.
Yeah, I'm Anu. It's just a very simple question, and probably Professor Pandey's answered it already. I just wanted to ask whether the move to nuclear families in this modern period has it led to a shift in women just being seen as little mothers? This might be a bigger question, but I would love to hear what you have to say about this.
Thanks, Anu. Thank you for asking the question. I didn't realize you were here because, as Razi said, you appear as iPhone 7. Anu is an old friend, a one-time student from Delhi University, and a very distinguished writer in her own right. And I know that's an important question. I'm not sure that I have a good or ready answer for it. I do believe that, you see, I think fatherhood is new in the industrial and post-industrial age. I think fatherhood is new in colonial and post-colonial India. Even the notion of fatherhood, the way in which it is enacted, because there were fathers all around. The father was all elders. Fathers was the community. Now that applies to women too, but motherhood has a different quality. There is a biological mother who has, for many, many months, if not years, primary responsibility for a child in most conditions. And given that, I do not know that the idea of motherhood did not exist. I would not say that. One could almost say fatherhood did not exist. That's overstating it, but one cannot say motherhood did not exist, because not only of biological conditions of birth, but biological conditions of nurturing, which women fulfilled. And if that's the case, I suspect that this equation of woman and mother, the little mother, may be longer standing in some ways. Nonetheless, I am suggesting that the emergence of the modern notion of the nuclear family in India, the three-generational family very often, the emergence of that smaller unit leads to a centering of mother and father in a way in which it has probably not been done before, and in a way in which the mother emerges as the woman then the girl emerges as prospective mother, as primarily mother, as self-sacrificing maker of home and giver of care, right? And if that's the case, then there is some connection with the nuclear family. But as I say, it's a large question with ramifications that I would have to think through more carefully, and perhaps you will think through and write about in something that you're writing anyway.
Yeah, thank you. I look forward to your book.
All right. So let me see. Frank was here. I think she just left. Such a misfortune. Anyway, I just was about to ask her, but anyway, she left. Anybody else? If anybody else has any question or comments to make, that's fine. Otherwise, it has been almost like 2 hours, so we can end it here. And thank you very much. Your 2 other colleagues have already left because they had to go and participate somewhere else. So they wrote me saying sorry, they could not stay any further. So thank you all, and thank you very much, Gyan Sahab, for illuminating us, or really a very new thing. I mean, I was also totally, I mean, we all have things that we understand, but the way you expressed and detailed it, it is really a very good thing to know. So thank you very much. And I would certainly going to promote the book and buy it myself.
Thank you, Razi Saab and your colleagues. I want to thank you all. Thank you for the invitation.